Jonathan Lethem may be described as a Renaissance man, or possibly a schizophrenic. He plays with painting, music, filmmaking, animation, and writing. He loves to move an idea from one of those forms into the other. You can't pin him down to a genre. You'll think you're reading some hard-boiled detective story, and then you've morphed into science fiction or autobiography, humor. You can't even pin him down to a length. He's written 9 novels, but also plays widely with shorter forms. I love his short stories, from essays to novels, magazine articles, novellas, and short story collections. His latest novel is Dissident Gardens, and as ever, the craft of it, the flow of stories and captivating characters, the richness of life that he brings to all of his work is here again. In New York, in Queens and Greenwich Village, and at the middle of the I bet you never guessed how fascinating it was, mid-20th century, a cast of disparate characters come together over leftist ideology, bringing to it all of their energies, their enthusiasms, their dreams, drugs, heart, humor, hubris, and sheer zaniness. And as you get caught up with them, somehow you understand how American communism could be born and nurtured, how any ideology could be. It's brilliant and moving and a downright funny way to absorb that lesson, and it's another marvelous work. Book Passage is thrilled to present Jonathan Lethem.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for coming out. Pour myself a little water. So, this book is kind of sprawling with lots of different characters and situations in it, but it's centered on 2 women. Rose, who's young in the 1930s and is swept up in the American communist movement, and that suffers all the different kinds of disasters and compromises that go with that kind of commitment on through the 40s, 50s, and beyond. And her daughter, Miriam, who is born right in the middle of World War II, and that means she's the right age to kind of run away from Queens to Greenwich Village and join the folk movement at the very end of the 50s, very beginning of the 60s, and be part of the counterculture. So those 2 are really the heart of the book, and then there are all these men kind of swirling around these two women. The bit I'm going to read right now is from the point of view of Tommy Gogan. He's an Irish folk singer who Miriam will end up marrying. He's ended up in the village because he's part of a kind of a brother act. He and his brothers are the Gogan boys. Kind of not that different in some ways from the Clancy brothers, but maybe they're like a grade Z Clancy brothers. And he's the youngest, and he doesn't really like the fake Blarney and the Irish folk song gig, but he's been swept up in this by his older brothers. And he's wishing to break out and become like a relevant topical folk singer. He wants to be Bob Dylan or at least Phil Oakes or something in that vein. Although actually this sequence is before anyone's really broken out of that. The big man around town is Dave Van Rock at this point. And anyway, so this is from Tommy's point of view, from the day, the afternoon and the night when he first meets Miriam, who is this wild, barefoot, queen of the city, queen of Greenwich Village. And I think that's all I need to say. You'll just basically hear from Tommy, and you'll see Miriam emerge, and then one of Tommy's other brothers, the obnoxious older brother, folk singer, Peter Gogan, appears just briefly at the end of the sequence. It was one famous wintry morning in February 1960 when he trekked to Corona Park in a famous howling snowstorm in the company of a famous young white blues singer to pay call on a famous old black blues singer, one who was also an ordained minister. And so, as the legend would be carried between them for the rest of their lives, Tommy Goguen and Miriam Zimmer ought to have asked the Reverend to marry them on the spot. The enlivening fame of it all, of Dave Van Ronk and the Reverend Gary Davis, and the fame of the storm, photographs of which dominated the newspapers the next 2 days, the halted plows and choked subway entrances, the skiers in Central Park, all of this became subsumed into the mad dream of that day and the days immediately following, the intramural fame of two lovers' discovery of each other. Tommy would wonder forever and find no good answer as to why on earth he braved this storm in Dave Van Ronk's borrowed Nash Rambler to go sit at the Reverend Gary Davis's feet, to witness a tutorial on finger picking. He, Tommy, who finger picked, or so the joke went, as if his right hand was a foot, and a duck's webbed one at that. Who knew whether Van Ronk was even clear on Tommy's name before then? But in his gregarious, the older folkie swept Tommy along. She'd been sitting at the table with the Reverend's wife. The house was tiny, in a suburb of tiny houses on tilted streets, snow piling up like it might bury the whole thing by the time they scraped into a parking spot using garbage can lids, then scurried inside to warm up their hands. Gary Davis occupied his chair with the solemn posture of a wooden carving, aside from the flurry of fingers at his frets and the tapping of his right shoe. He wore shades indoors, for he was blind and likely never removed them indoors or out. She sat at the table in the kitchen with the Reverend's wife and another couple of Negro women. Tommy was fairly sure there had been another couple of Negro women in the kitchen, dressed like younger versions of Mrs. Annie, as the Reverend's wife was introduced to him. Daughters, perhaps, or sisters. Another white man, too, had preceded them in their visit here. He sat in study with his own guitar on the sofa across from the Reverend. Tommy recognized this man, Barry Kornfeld, a banjo player. Tommy saw Miriam and conceived immediately the jealous notion that Kornfeld might be her boyfriend. Miriam didn't get up immediately, but beckoned in friendly hilarity to see Van Ronk stomping his feet clean of snow at the foyer. A hail greeting like that of one pal calling to another across 2 West 4th Street subway platforms. Kornfeld wasn't her boyfriend, or wasn't any longer. Tommy was never to press Miriam for the facts of her relations before they met. She was 20 years old, well, almost 20, she'd explain later, and a McDougal Street familiar, diaphragm in her purse until she could be among the pill's first customers. Whatever went on before had been blown away for her as totally as it had been for him, or if not, he didn't care to know. The Reverend had been slowing down an arrangement of Sportin' Life blues so the younger men could follow him. Someone placed a saucer with a fresh piece of crumb coffee cake awkwardly on Tommy's knees. Plucked notes rose to the steamed window panes and beyond, to cold heaven. Tommy wished he could hold on, if he could, to the memory of that moment when she stood from her place at the table with the Reverend's wife and entered the parlor where the men sat, to halt that instant and try to see her face as he first saw it, to know what it might be like to have gazed into her eyes before she began talking. But by the time he took anything remotely like full stock, she'd donned her own sunglasses, dark wayfarers, well advised in the pale blare of the snowstorm. Therefore, to gaze in the direction of her eyes was only to watch the fat flakes spatter against those dark windshields below her wild, unhatted, raven-black hair, which collected a bonnet of snow at the outermost, where the heat of her body left it unmelted, as blobs clung unmelted to the shoulders and front of her coarse, heavy checkerboard coat. For she said she'd become bored immediately at the guitar lesson, and had excused herself to Mrs. Annie and the men, and said the L train would still be working and that she knew her way there, and would maybe Tommy care to walk her. He would care to, yes. The two tumbled and staggered together on the clotted sidewalks, the whole sky swirling mad flakes, plunging to melt at the heat of their cheeks and tongue and hands, or to array on her coat. By this time she'd been talking so much he couldn't regain his head, couldn't recapture his ground. Before he'd begun to ask, she'd said, "Yes, I know who you are. I've seen you sing." Had they met before, he asked. No, they never met, not exactly, but she knew him. And now he knew her, Miriam Zimmer. She said, "I know who you are," as if to know Tommy Gogan's name was to possess knowledge of some definite person who bore it, knowledge he lacked himself. Beginning that famous day in the snow, when she drew him back to Peter's loft, and they shared some reefer and then brewed a pot of coffee for the derelicts, and she explained to him why the Bowery was called what it was, perhaps he did begin to gain some knowledge of himself. It was as if she imparted it to him. The L train barely slugged along its rail where snow had amassed. Their car, entirely empty, though the trains tottering past on the opposite track, bulged with the snow-fearful workers fleeing the island of Manhattan at 3 p.m. while they could, as though Manhattan had been hit by the hydrogen bomb, and only fools would go in the direction they did. And as they inched into the tunnel, the skyline was effaced. White turned to black, and still she wore her sunglasses, and for all he knew, he'd missed forever his chance to see her eyes. Tommy had a puff of reefer 2 or 3 times before and found it not a revelation. Not like this day, but which was chicken and which egg on such a day of revelations. In defense against the onslaught, he picked up his silver-toned guitar, shoring his fumbling tongue with a few bar chords. There was no advantage in putting his own finger-picking up against the Reverend's. Thank Christ his brother Peter was out. The dark fell almost before they'd gotten upstairs, but they did nothing but light Peter's candlesticks. She'd arranged both their shoes on the clanking radiator, then found her way to the cabinets and uncorked a bottle of red wine she discovered there, filled 2 juice glasses halfway. The reefer came out of her handbag as if she'd planned it. This absconding of him, this near kidnapping. She lit it on a candle. They'd kissed already once, everything else not delivered but promised. Kissed in the snow-smashed route from the subway. No saying who'd initiated what, as their plunging footfalls arranged collisions between their bodies. Not so once indoors, where couch, armchair, man's body with coat removed, woman's body with coat removed, table between them, door for possible entrances or exits, all of these stood at a concrete and painful distance, to be navigated with deliberation or not at all. His skin hived with risk, supersensitivity to her presence, the soda prickle of frozen extremities reclaiming life, dread of the clock's advancement to some outcome. Here's the first song I ever wrote, he said, and began strumming the opening chords to A Lynching on Pearl River. At this moment, in the flood of marijuana feeling, he wished to hear his own song. So, after the first instrumental pass, he sang out the lyric for all he was worth. That's the first song, huh? She said. Yes, he said, yes. Then play me the one after that, she said. She leaned forward, not missing a thing. He almost wished she would miss a thing, turn aside. She'd shed her wayfarers now, with the result only that he couldn't look at her directly. Her attentions had seemed to him like a glorious bottle, into which he'd hoped to slip himself and then expand, like a model ship, sails tucked until the moment they rose to occupy every corner. Instead, he felt like a lightning bug, zooming inside only to be swallowed, rebounding against the impassive glass, pulsing a small light so as not to be lost inside. Oughtn't the reefer have made her distractible? It hadn't. The world was close around them, eye of the storm, dark fallen entirely outside the windows. Tommy had gone from finding it difficult to imagine his brother Peter staying away a minute longer to a willed certainty that his brother had anchored himself at the bar of McSorley's and would ride out the night laid upon or beneath a wooden bench. Miriam Zimmer went on talking whenever Tommy paused in his playing, and he at once drank her talk in and missed it entirely, besotted as he was with interior murmurings, now vain, now self-flagellating, now quizzical. The difficulty in beholding another person was how you stood in your own way. To be struck open, as Tommy had just now been struck, was to wade into a mire of self-beholding. For an Irishman, she said, you sure sing an awful lot about blacks. He just unspooled a slack rendition of Sharpeville Massacre. If her remark was provocation, nothing in her expression gave it away. He couldn't quite think how to answer her, not in her own language. He didn't possess any other. "Did I make you uncomfortable?" she said. "Would you rather I said Negroes?" "I suppose I do sing of them a lot," he managed. "Maybe I'll do it just to harass my brothers." "South Africa, Haiti, Mississippi," she said. "Hell, Tom, have you traveled to any of these places?" "I'm defenseless to the charges," he said. "My way of composing is to plunder newspaper headlines." "You should visit the South," she said. "I hear it's a head trip." "I've thought I'd like to," he said, "but minstrel trios aren't much in demand." "I mean, you should go without your brothers," she said. "Ah," he said, "maybe I should. Peter keeps us working, though. There's scarcely an interruption." "What's missing," she said, "what's missing are voices, Tom." "Missing from what?" "From your songs." Her words were neither chiding nor gentle. It might be that no one had ever listened to him sing until this instant, not even himself. His mother called him Thomas, his father's son, his brothers Tommy. Nobody had ever called him Tom. "We've got blacks, you know," she said. "Negroes, of our own. I mean, you only have to go downstairs." The two of them had stepped, as a matter of necessity, over and around huddled figures making nests in the storm, just to arrive here at Peter's doorstep. The men littering the Bowery were black by definition. It was at this moment that he resolved to join her in exchanging the one word for the other. Whatever the shades of their faces, they were blackened by condemnation. Tommy never looked at them if he could help it. He schooled himself to see her now, to gaze past her blinding allure, her decorations and aura, the several bracelets clanking as she waved her hand, her beatnik's wrinkled plaid skirt and thin turtleneck, the raven cackle of her hair, to instead meet her seeking hazel eyes, to address the twist of her wide lips, which formed a smirk so perpetual, so embracing in its implications, it absolved its recipient of individual judgment. In this woman's gaze, you were swept into a condition of universal exasperation and forgiveness at once. "Let's brew them a pot of coffee," she said. "Who?" he said. "The guys downstairs," she said, "if they aren't frozen into statues already. Come on." She leaped up, began shoveling grind into his brother's percolator. "Served in what?" he said. "We'll bring down cups," she said. "We'll collect them afterwards." "Well, we can't serve them all," he said. "Who said all?" She hunted in the sink and the cabinet. "What do you say we serve 4? Oh, you guys are certainly awfully skimpy on china. Not expecting more than 2 overnight guests at a go, huh?" He could only gape. "Nothing more in storage?" She put on her coat and shoved the 4 ceramic cups into its 2 big pockets. "Here," he said, ducking into the bathroom and taking Peter's meerschaum shaving mug from atop the sink. He chucked the brush aside and rinsed it clean. 5. Miriam gaped at the meerschaum mug's beard and scowl. "Holy shit," she said. "Talk about your gruesome cliches. This is the last household that ought to feature leprechaun tchotchkes." "That's no leprechaun," he said. "He's the green man." You say potato, I say potato. Reclaiming shoes not dried, but now poached and reeking from their spell atop the radiator, Tommy and Miriam ferried the fresh pot and the 5 cups down 2 flights of stairs, out into a storm trickling to its conclusion. Under windless street lamps, the creaking white hand blanketed the world's contours, each windowsill and lintel, all God's immobile windshields and volcanic trash cans, the sole exception being those human figures who struggled past, punching out caverns with their knees, huffing steam into their fingerless gloves. Miriam found her 5 huddling in a Fleabag Hotel's entranceway. She distributed the cups and poured the first service of coffee, then planted the pot in a mound at their feet, where it scorched a hole for itself to rest in. The green man was shoved into the chafed hands of a black derelict with leathery, pitted cheeks. "Top yourselves off. There's enough to go around," she said. "We'll return in 15 minutes to collect the utensils, gentlemen." She tugged his elbow, and they slugged in the tracks others had forged by now, towards Houston Street. Come on, she said, let's get a tattoo. I don't think they're open, he said. I'm kidding, she said. Look, up there, that's where Rothko paints. Is that what you wanted me to see, he asked. No, look. She pointed across the wide intersection at Houston and Bowery. This is the Bowery, right here. She was gesturing in the air. I don't understand, he said. I didn't expect you to, she said. You know why it's called the Bowery? This used to be where New York ended. She directed his attention behind them, the direction they'd come. The Dutch, they had this footpath leading to the farms and woods. There was a bower here, like a giant arbor. She drew it again in the moat-strewn air above. You passed through the Bowery, you'd exited the city. You'd gone into the wilderness. Tommy saw what she wished him to. The phantasmal cityscape above Houston might revert at any moment to wild before the snows melted off. I've been living here with no idea at all, he said. Nobody knows this stuff, she bragged. Somebody could write a song about this, he said. Somebody could write a great song about this. These words she whispered. If he could, he'd have used his scarf to bind her mouth to his ear, to hear again the electrical hush of her voice in the canyons of the halted storm. See, she said, if you think about it, that's probably the reason the bums and the old sailors stack up around here. They're waiting to pass through, even if they don't realize it. Yes, he said. Like entry to the gardens, to Eden. Sure, she said. Or else up to 14th Street in hopes of a cut-rate fuck. Nothing in the Pelican anthology of love poetry had prepared him remotely. That Tommy could see that this girl sought to topple and outrage him was no help. He was toppled and outraged. She was a child woman with the eerie preternaturality of a 10-year-old, the sort that stared at and through you on public transport, yet with the self-possession of someone older than herself. Older sister I never had, he thought, and then winced, was mortified by the cruddy predictability of the thought. After this storm in which the sun had been blotted out, the clock destroyed, what was meant to happen? Was he supposed to take her to bed? Did love at first sight mean you weren't to let the person out of your sight once you'd spotted them? Listen, she said, you don't need to pretend you're in wherever, Algeria, Tom, or the Delta. I mean, look, even the Reverend Gary Davis moved to Queens. Those guys down there, they're the real thing. This shit is all around us. This proclamation she'd made on the stairs as they returned bearing the cups and coffee pot collected from the destroyed men huddling in the flophouse entranceway. The derelicts had drained the coffee and then handed over the cups in mute, crushed gratitude. Except Miriam had pushed the meerschaum shaving mug back into the crabbed claws of the one who'd held it. Keep it, buddy, she said. That's a good luck charm. They call it the Green Man. He moved his mouth in reply, yet nothing was audible apart from his address to Miriam as ma'am. Now, she said, you really talk to these guys. You find out they riveted girders on the Empire State Building, or got a Purple Heart at the Bulge, or played trumpet in Fletcher Henderson's band. They're always about 1,000% more interesting than whatever dumb, pitying story you've been telling yourself. That's what some genius ought to get into a song. Before Miriam Zimmer's vision could be further developed, it met its nullification in the form of Peter Gauguin. Slushy tracks of his unremoved boots demarcating his beery, suspicious perambulation of the apartment. Tommy's brother had been examining the condition Tommy and Miriam had left it in when fleeing. The candles guttering, the red inches in the juice glasses, smoking traces in the ashtray. Someone's been sitting in my chair, Miriam whispered. Why, hello, good brother, said Peter. Some weather we're having, eh? Be a gentleman now and introduce me to your lady friend. While Tommy sought his voice, Miriam pushed the snow-streaked coffee pot into Peter's hands, then began unloading cups from the pocket of her coat, as in a magic act. She barely entered the apartment, arranging the cups on the shelves near the door. My name is Miriam Zimmer Farbstein. I'm from Students Against Kish, and I'm horrendously sorry to have to announce, good brother Gauguin, that my colleague and I have just taken it upon ourselves to liberate your unicorn. My unicorn, you say? She means your leprechaun, Tommy managed, and at that word, he and Miriam collapsed in shambles of hilarity there in the doorway, skating into a puddle of their own melting shoes and trouser cuffs. Their limbs glided together, coats like a tent collapsed, brains dissolving in a fever of mirth, their whole selves liquid, except now, in the tangle between them, for the first time, Tommy felt his hard-on like a brick unlaid. And then Miriam was on her feet, abandoning him there, not even straightening her hair or coat or uncrossing her wild eyes, but said, "I've got to go. Good night to you both, Gogan boys," and was down the stairs and gone. Thanks. Thank you. And now I would love to answer any questions. This book is a really long one. It's only been out a very short time, so you might not.
This is where the wine.
Oh yeah, and I want the wine. Thank you. You know, if you can ask me about what I just read, or something you heard about the book, or about anything else, any of the older ones, or whatever you think I can help with. Hi.
Hi, that's fantastic. Been a
Thank
huge
you.
fan ever since one of those books.
Thank you.
Two things. As an author, why did you pick that particular passage to read? I mean, it must mean something obviously to
Yeah.
you. If you could talk about that, what you think you achieved there, or why it was a good one to read.
It's a great question.
And then the other question is, you've done a series of interviews with Slate, which are pretty cool, and I thought it was a fascinating question that I know that you didn't really disagree with. That I think it was, compared to Motherless Brooklyn, if this book represents you growing up, because it's moved away
Yeah.
from some of
those sort of
the science fiction
antic or fantastical
right.
stuff.
And,
Yeah.
and I gathered that you strongly disagreed with that, but I didn't know exactly why. So
Yeah.
those two
Sure,
things.
sure. Well, you know, I mean, I'm always growing up. I never finish. And I think, well, let me back up. Let me take your reading question first, because that other thought is really slippery, but I bet I can address it. I read that part because I love that part. And, you know, I mean, I've only been reading aloud from this book in public for about 10 days. And I'm trying different sequences, but that's one I latched onto a couple of readings ago, and I liked the momentum in it, and also the joy in it. I mean, it's a pretty sad book. There's a lot of slow arcs into despair or defeat for these various characters. But I also believe that they're very alive. They're very alive to me, and their hopefulness means a lot to me. And so I'm excited by this sense of jubilation that, you know, Tommy, and wonder that Tommy's experiencing as he meets Miriam for the first time. I don't know, I love the anecdote about the Bowery. In a way, you know, when someone pointed that out to me, it's like one of those jokes you never finish laughing at, or thoughts that is an epiphany every time. I still like to think about how the city used to end at that, New York City used to end at that place, and that led to the wilds and the farmlands north of the settlement, the Dutch settlement. So I just like telling this aloud, because it helps me remember that pleasure of discovery. So what happened in that conversation with Jacob Weisberg on Slate that you saw a little video of, is he was asking me about the fact that a couple of reviewers in praising this book sort of talked about it as me outgrowing my adolescent fixations in favor of something more grown up. And I, you know, in the department of looking gift horses in the mouth, I actually quibbled with this praise in a way, because I just feel, you know, first of all, I'm a 50-year-old man. If I didn't grow up a while ago, in some sense, it's you know, it's trouble for me. I'm a father, and it, you know, I actually also reserve the right to write sillier books again after this one. So I just felt there was a kind of an oversimple image that was being suggested, that, you know, I'd sort of been this experienced this very delayed adolescence, and that explained a lot of the things about some of the earlier books, and now I had entered my maturity, and that explained this book. And I just think that's a story, it's kind of like a biopic or something that a critic is sort of inadvertently writing about me, but it's not really me as I experience myself. The things I'm thinking about in this book connect very strongly to things I was thinking about and writing about in others. Some of them, like The Fortress of Solitude, I think quite obviously connected, and that was 10 years ago. So maybe, if I didn't, what did I do? Grow up at 40 and then I got silly again and then I grew up again at 50? It just doesn't make sense. But also, for me, some of the most serious stuff I've done has been sublimated into some of those fantastical stories. Like there's one called Girl in Landscape, a book I wrote in 96 and 97, that deals in a very grave way with, intimate experiences of loss, and my mother's death is portrayed in that book. So I feel like I have been making confrontations with my own seriousness in the books for a long time, and also, as I say, reserving the right to combine it with playful things. Which, by the way, there's tomfoolery and silliness in this book. I read you a bit of it with the shaving mug and the Miriam's teasing. So to me, it is oversimple to say I was one thing and then another. So I was sort of pushing back against that, I guess, a little bit. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. The improbability of a lot of what you read, the communist daughter with the Irish folk band, as you pointed out, Clancy brother-like, but not quite. Where's your interest in that pre-60s, not just pop culture, but culture of the time, which is an extraordinary segue to all of our modern trends and problems? Where does that come from, and why were you trying to play that into this story, which is 30s in origin, if you will?
Well, this book ranges. It begins. It doesn't begin. It moves back and forth in time, but it goes as far back as the 30s, and it ends up with scenes that are in 2012. It comes right up to the contemporary, and I got to this project by thinking about my mother's life and my grandmother's life. They're very much in the mix for me in this book, which isn't to say they're being portrayed directly. But I did have a lot of fertile material to draw on in thinking about their lives, and also, equally fertile, I had a lot of questions, gray areas, things I didn't know about their lives, but became avenues for me to speculate and wonder and kind of project into. And since they weren't around anymore, I couldn't investigate these things directly. If I'd been a memoir writer, I would have had to abandon this project. But as a novelist, what you don't know is almost as valuable as what you do know, because it becomes this invitation to, dream it up and exaggerate and borrow other people's lives. I read a lot of memoirs and accounts, and I just also made up stuff that satisfied or fascinated me in this pursuit, But I wouldn't say that, I know that I am not portraying the two lives of the two women who happened to be my grandmother and mother, but I wouldn't say that anything, the 20th century imposed a lot of preposterous experience on a lot of different people, and I don't think that there's anything in this book that's, where my imagination surpassed the historical possibilities, which are outlandish and contain all sorts of crazy facts. So,
You could have done the Weavers instead of the Irish. Is that just fun and mix it up?
Yeah, I feel my way into the cultural references that sort of somehow open the material for me, and there's something about. I actually, to be really specific, I kind of got to that Tommy Gogan character because I was thinking about Phil Oakes a lot, about what it was to be sort of the slightly less than Dylan, to drag along in his wake. And in a way, I wanted to make up a character who was another degree. I guess I write about failure a lot, and I just wanted to make up someone who almost was to Phil Oakes as Phil Oakes was to Dylan. Just dragging onto the coattails and hoping to become an important topical singer. And so something about this, third wheel Irish brother who was only in the folk scene by accident in a way, because at the beginning of his section you learn that he immigrated from Belfast and to Toronto and was working as a bricklayer. His brothers were singing and they said, "Come down, it's good times down here. You can get laid." And he just sort of fell into it. So he's really, I guess another thing I write about along with failure is imposture a lot. People who try to become things, but they're also pretending, they're playing at roles and testing them out. And so he's trying to figure out whether he has a place in this scene. Yeah, thanks. Hey.
Yeah, thank you so much for beautiful writing. I lived in the village then. I walked through snowstorms. I knew girls like that. I was part of the left scene and part of the folk music scene.
Yeah.
And I heard it as a memoir, and it was just beautiful.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, what's great is there are a lot of great accounts of that time. I mean, Van Ronk's memoir was really important to me. He wrote a beautiful book, or I guess he had a co-writer for it. But also, that girl on Dylan's arm on the cover of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, Suze Rotolo, wrote a very beautiful memoir about very undefensive, simple account of just what it was to happen to be in that place in that time. And, here's my luck. She was a girl from Queens who grew up with a communist mother. So I could kind of, smash my own mother and the things I didn't know about her life together with things that were revealed to me in Suze Rotolo's memoir, and that was just, perfect opportunity for magpie work on my part. Hey.
What's your research process like? Did you do a bunch of research and then kind of go, okay, I got it, and then elaborate it or come back to it?
Almost exactly the opposite of that. I being not a researcher and I have no scholarly training. I mean, I didn't do well in school. I never wrote dissertations or ever was did systematic archival or scholarly work. Instead, I come from the point of view of wanting to create stuff, images, scenarios, set pieces that I'm in some way I'm intuiting what they should be like, but then I realize, oh God, I need some facts. I'm like, I need to make this work. I need to persuade myself, first of all, it just has to be, I need to sort of enrich this with knowledge so that I can bullshit, And so what I did in this case, I wrote about 150 pages of this book on pure bluff, out of what I wished the book to be. And chapters that are still here, that 150 pages are in the book, but I had to go back and fix them and enrich them. And then I hit a limit where I was, oh my God, in this case, more than any other time I ever set out, I was forcing myself into a research position. And then I began gathering materials and absorbing them, but it was very scattershot. It was, just guesses about what I was interested in and what might fill it in. And sometimes the research offers you something to write about that you weren't planning to. So it's a series of blind operations, groping operations into the accounts. One crazy accident was I walked around in Queens a lot. I went to Sunnyside, just walked and felt what I could from the streets, because it isn't my legacy as directly as Brooklyn is, but I wanted to write about it with that kind of investment and just kind of that somatic, like physical sense of the place. But when you're doing that, you feel like an idiot. You don't know what you're there for, and it's just houses after a certain point. So you do things to make yourself feel less stupid. I walked into but it wasn't even a used bookstore, it was a junk shop, like a thrift shop. And there was a shelf of like 15 really dirty, dusty books there that you wouldn't be drawn to, except I look at books anywhere old books are being sold. And I found this book that was a memoir of coming of age in a leftist farm commune in New Jersey called the Jersey Homesteads, which I'd never even heard of. And some people who are much more knowledgeable than I am about the history of the socialist, Jewish socialist, East Coast have said to me, I never heard of that place, but after I read about it in the book, I checked and it's real. I can't believe, where did you? Well, I happened to find this book in Sunnyside. I don't know whether there was actually a lineage. Someone had, lived in the homesteads and then been interested because their sister or their grandparent or somebody had lived in the homesteads. But anyway, here it was, and I put it in the book. It became a whole chapter. So you just rely on sometimes, fortune smiling on your project that way. Hey.
It's interesting. The idea in this kind of country, there's the idea of the winners and almost winners, and then and there was a book, a really good book called Positively Forestry. It's talking about the Farina,
Richard Farina, yeah.
Richard Farina and Dylan and Jim Baez, and there's a certain, I don't know, one thing I noticed about celebrity is the people that in general want to be celebrities are the ones that make it, more so than just their talent. And it's and there's something else, in the folk scene, even though it's supposed to be this kind of, hey, we're all cool here and all that beatniky 60s kind of melange. There was still this kind of sharp-edged sense of ambition for a certain, certain of the personalities, and I mean that place. I'm feeling there's that kind of tension.
Your intuition is really, really good in the sense that one of the things that interested me so much about that feeling about what Greenwich Village was, what the folk scene was that it was premised in some way on collegiality or communal exploration and sharing, and of course literally folk songs are premised on a kind of commons of material. And then it became suddenly, with Dylan's ascension, everyone became obsessed with where did he steal it from and where did it come, who's not getting credit, and and I think when you look at the rage that was expressed when he went electric, I mean obviously there was a visceral response to the musical change, but I think also it was what couldn't be enunciated at the time it was about, oh wait, he didn't ask.
Right.
He didn't we didn't make us all do it together. It's just like he's just going away, and he's just leaving the scene behind and pretending that he doesn't emerge from any communal transaction. He's just a solo inventor. And of course this is, in a larger sense, this is the story that the book is constantly bumping against, is possibilities of communal or commons in American life, and then individual, the incredibly powerful individualism and isolationism and
ambition.
And ambition, yes, that isolates people.
Yeah.
Of course. Great, thanks. Anything more? A couple more? I'm still game.
This is a craft question.
Sure.
How do you work with an editor? Where do you get to a point and what does an editor do with you and for you? And
I like to try to turn in a pretty finished book. I'm pretty private with the work for a long time and hoard it and try to, in my mind, perfect it. It's like I want to roll it out and just have it be a smash, fait accompli. No one could possibly object, and then so I don't show early drafts or portions of books to my editor, even though he's a very, very good editor and it's a very trusting relationship by now. This is like the 10th book I've worked on with the same editor, but then he always has questions for me and things he wants me to look at again. It's usually on those terms. It's not. He doesn't really dictate changes or make them himself so much as say X, Y, and Z is that's great. I really like that. But then why are we here? What's this other thing? Maybe it's fine, but I don't know why it's. I was less interested, or could you clarify it? I didn't know why the emphasis was switching here, and so I'll puzzle over it. And sometimes he'll make suggestions. But very often, in a way, those end up being the same thing. It isn't that I take the suggestion so much as it means that there's something wrong. Something wasn't persuasive enough, and I need to look harder at that area, or amplify it or reduce it, because if it's raising questions or stopping his, enjoyment of the book, then I want to make it better. Yeah.
How much do you plot or pre-plot?
Well, I'm really I'm really excited by the idea of improvisation and freedom, that things can change as I go along, and that I've discovered there's an air of discovery in the work, and I try to paradoxically I try to make just enough structure that I have an opportunity to feel very free and invent and discover things. And for that reason, what is most meaningful to me is I usually have a really clear endpoint in mind. So the thing I'm most intentional about is I kind of know where I want to go, even if I don't know why. For some reason, I can't really work until I have like a really strong sense of a major set piece or two at the end that the book has to get to and earn and develop in this direction. And so that dictates a lot, because when you have something that you're moving toward, improvisation is limited in a really crucial way. Other than that, I try to leave myself as few boundaries as I can, so that each day feels like I'm in a really rich improv. But that also involves preparation, and I don't start a book having just thought about it for oh, that could be fun, let me start writing. Usually by the time I even begin a book, I've thought about it for years. It's been sort of an idea that's been sort of sitting there and accruing energy and weight and implication in my mind. So without using a lot of charts or diagrams or notes or outlines, there's kind of a presence that I'm responding to and trying to do justice to, an image of a book that I'm really wanting to make come to life, even if I don't have a plan per se. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Again, sure.
Well,
Yeah.
now,
Please.
Apart from your mention of your mother and your grandmother and putting them or references to them in this book, where do you place this book in the constellation of your other books? I mean, the reviewers, for example, cite history and ideology as key drivers in the display of them in American and contemporary American history and so on. So you're much more historical in that sense than I think you have. I think I've read all your books, but where do you put this book in the array of the others?
Well, it's really different in the one sense that I'm doing. I mean, I related very strongly to The Fortress of Solitude, except that The Fortress of Solitude extends so much from my own witnessing. And I wanted to write something that felt as heavy with the kind of intimate relationship to history and to the city that book did. But I was reliant on research and postulation instead of my own evidence. So, to me, that's the strongest relationship, and it's also the strongest difference. It is a historical novel. Now, I'm always conscious. It's obvious. I'm always thinking about genre, even when it's not a really corny, obvious genre like the Western or the hard-boiled detective story or the dystopian novel, things I've engaged with directly. Sometimes it's something more elusive that doesn't have like a separate section in the bookstore, like the academic novel. And I did one of those when I wrote a book called As She Climbed Across the Table. Well, with this book, I was realizing, I guess for better or worse, I'm writing a historical novel, and that was a strange thing for me to accept, because I mostly don't like to, on the whole, I don't like to read historical novels. That isn't to say I don't like to read novels set in other times, but I usually want the books to be written at the time they're set. I want to read about the 50s by novelists who were there and writing about something that mattered to them enormously. So I thought, okay, now I'm doing a thing that I distrust in a way. So I had to make it real to myself, and there were a couple of different maneuvers that entailed. One was, if you've looked at this book, or if you've read it, or probably just you've even might have seen this described in those reviews you mentioned, I the structure in time is very weird. You know, whereas a historical novelist who's comfortable with the idea of the historical novel might have just started in the 30s and moved steadily and persuasively 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and just done it. Like, wow, here's the tapestry of history. In mine, you keep being interrupted by the present, thinking about the past. And I think that was my way of saying, I don't really believe in the historical novel. I believe that any image we have of the past is a construction of present minds and present language, you know, falsifying, guessing, projecting. So I wanted to show that. So my characters are constantly in the present, plunging back the way people do in the irregular, inconsistent, and extremely subjective way that you think about past histories. You kind of, you know, I mean, these characters are almost forced to remember or think about things in the past, and then they go kind of stumbling back into these legacies. By doing that, I think I was doing justice in my own way to the what felt to me the treacherousness of historical reconstruction. So there's an answer. Yeah. Okay. Maybe one last, and then I'll sign some books for you guys if there is one last.
What are you working on now?
Oh, well, I've taken a longer break from my own fiction after this book than I have done than I normally do. The only other time I felt like the book left me as plumbed out was The Fortress of Solitude. And at the time, my response was to write a bunch of nonfiction, and I wrote a whole sequence of essays that became a collection called The Disappointment Artist. And what I've done with this last few months since finishing this book and before coming out to talk about it a lot is even more scattered. I've just done almost like finger exercises. I wrote a big book review of a Thomas Pynchon novel, and I wrote a liner note for an album of musicians covering Bob Dylan's songs from the 80s, like the lost decade for Dylan, but one that I actually cherish. So it was a fun thing to do. And I'm doing this other thing that is very Marin specific, which is there's a writer who meant a lot to me, still means a lot to me, who is mostly out of print, although he's being revived slightly now, named Don Carpenter, who lived in Mill Valley. And I discovered his writing when I was living in Berkeley, really when I was becoming a writer. And his first novel, Hard Rain Falling, was a big influence on The Fortress of Solitude specifically. And anyway, I've written and spoken about him here and there, mentioned his name, and so his last editor, a guy named Jack Shoemaker, who was the editor at North Point Press when Carpenter was still alive. His last couple of novels came out from North Point Press. Shoemaker had Carpenter's last manuscript, which was a not quite finished novel called Fridays at Enrico's, and it's about Mill Valley and North Beach and Portland, Oregon. I've spent the summer, along with the other things I've been doing, I've been finishing Carpenter's book, which mostly just means retyping it. It's mostly so good I just don't have to do anything at all, but I've been enjoying kind of running his sentences through my own hands. And I don't know what my next own big real project will be. I've got a few things I'm kind of auditioning, but I seem to be stalling. I think I'm enjoying not knowing for the moment. Yeah. Thanks for asking. And thanks everyone for coming.